Grace and peace. My name is Masayahu Israel, and it is indeed a pleasure to be with you again this week. What we have for you today is a video presentation on one of America's most important African American icons. This is a person that you've probably heard about, but you may not know the entire story. We hope to get a glimpse of that story today in the presentation. So get your pen, get your paper, and let's get ready to study Phillis Wheatley. Grace and peace. My name is Masayahu Israel, and we thank you for tuning in with us today for a video presentation on one of America's most unsung but yet most important heroes. Her name was Phillis Wheatley, and she was one of America's first poets. She was not only a first poet, but also a first African American and first African American female poet. And her book, Poems in Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was the first book written by a black woman in America, and only the second to be written by any woman, published in 1773. She was born in Africa in the year 1753. And ironically, her name, Phillis, was derived from the ship that brought her to America. The ship had recently returned from gathering slaves in West Africa. Now, she was then captured by slave traders and brought to America, where she was sold in July 1761 to the Wheatley family in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, after being taken home, she was actually tutored by Mary, one of the Wheatley children, in English and Latin. Now, she would be received by Benjamin Franklin and thanked by George Washington, but she remained unacknowledged by Thomas Jefferson. He was said to have noted, I quote, "Religion indeed has produced a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet." And this statement seems to dismiss the ability of slaves to have the necessary reflective and emotional attributes with which to write poetry. And it was believed widely at that time that Africans possessed a mental inferiority and that they were precluded from true intellectual creativity. Now, in autumn of 1772, Phillis was placed on a type of trial by some of the most influential men in Boston, and the event was to ascertain whether she was truly the author of her brilliant poetry, which had become well known and highly spoken of. And some thought that maybe some of those in attendance would have been Thomas Hutchinson, governor of the colony, John Hancock, first governor of the Commonwealth, Mather Byles, minister of the Hollis Street Congregational Church, and even Premier Wit Joseph Green. Now, Negro inferiority was the belief of the day, and David Hume said that, quote, "I'm apt to suspect that the Negroes in general, in all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to whites." And even Immanuel Kant, 10 years later, said, "So fundamental is the difference between the two races of man, it appears to be as great in regard to mental capacities as with color." So imagine a 17-year-old Wheatley in this situation being grilled by some of the highest and most influential men of the day. Now, later, after Mrs. Wheatley, the owner of Phillis, after her death in 1774, Phillis marries a man named Peters, and little is known about him, but he was said to have been handsome and educated, but unable to maintain a job. And during the time that she was married, she lived in great poverty, and yet she continued to write poems. A third of those poems, of the 100 that she wrote, have been lost to history. Her hard life and poverty eventually led to her death at the age of 31. Now, one might ask of the impact which she had, if any, upon the American Revolution. As was the case with Crispus Attucks, her influence was somewhat subtle, yet fully part of the inspiration and stimulus of the American Revolution. And she, like many other African Americans who, in their instances, were voiceless, they supported the cause of American freedom in their own way. Now, she immortalized the Boston Massacre in her poem entitled "On the Affray in King Street" on the evening of the 5th of March, 1770. And I'll read a stanza. "Long as in freedom's cause the wise contend, dear to your unity shall fame extend, while to the world the letters stone shall tell how Caldwell, Attucks, Gray, and Maverick fell." Now, in another poem that she wrote to George Washington, I'll read a stanza from this. She says, "Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine. With gold unfading, Washington be thine. Now, some critics have been disturbed that her poetry is not more in tune with modern political and even racial consciousness. And some, misunderstanding the time and mind of a slave, thought that she might have adopted a white voice and abandoned her own black voice and also her race. This judgment is by appearance only, as it is not a right judgment of the virtues of her heart. And her work should be explored to see how the life of a slave and the teaching of slaves affected her sense of self and identity. She did indeed acknowledge that her condition as a slave was most unusual, at least, and she's not disparaging her blackness, showing us the reality of her unique experience. Collins informs us that there was a fine line for her to tread between her own feelings and those of her patrons and readers, without whom she would have never been heard. Now, as historians holding a biblical worldview, it is important to be understood that the historian has to dedicate him or herself to a reasoned and investigated reconstruction of primary sources. And we've lost 30 of Phyllis's, but the ones that remain allow us to be able to understand who she was and her struggles and influences on American culture. And as I always say, it takes a level of dedication to piece through these tedious records in order to preserve such a meaningful aspect of American history. We thank you so much for tuning in today, and we hope that you've learned about this great American, Phyllis Wheatley. And until next time, we say to you, grace and peace.